Thanks. So it's really nice to be back, although it's almost unrecognizable. Waterloo has changed so much. So I really need to update my bio because I'm not going to talk about much of what was mentioned earlier, but I am going to talk about eco-hydrology. And my perspective, there's many different ways to define eco-hydrology, but my perspective is really this two-way interaction. I'm interested in the role of plants in determining how much water we have available in streams, in groundwater, how much water is available for us and maybe for fish. But I'm interested in eco-hydrology from the eco perspective. Plants need water, right? So what happens to plant and microbial biogeochemical cycling processes as water availability and water connectivity changes? And, you know, it's worth noting, if you care about how much water plants use, well, why do we care about that? Well, it's because plants use a prodigious amount of water. And I think it's helpful to get a sense of the scale of that. If you look at the amount of evapotranspiration from forested land in the US, I moved to the US, so I have all these US graphs now. I really should have Canada in here. But it uses the same amount of water that comes out of the Mississippi River. Those of you that know anything about the US, it's a really big river, right? It's the amount of water in the entire Lake Erie, right? So how much water forests use in the US is an important question, right? But water availability, as I've said, also matters for the vegetation itself. In California, for example, this has become a really big issue. In one of the most recent droughts in the early 2000s, or between 2010 and 2015, millions of trees died because of that drought, right? This is a huge ecological change. Not only do trees die, but they catch on fire. Wildfire losses in California and in the western US have resulted in billions of dollars in damages, not to mention, of course, the catastrophic loss in human life. So, in order to address these kinds of questions, you really have to be cross-disciplinary. A little shout out here for the AGU Eco-hydrology Technical Committee. They have a blog, and if you're interested in eco-hydrology, I suggest you read the blog and please submit yourself as a leaf. What we're trying to do is characterize what eco-hydrology means to the eco-hydrology community. And we actually just recently published a paper in Hydrologic Processes summarizing some of the results from the blog. And one of the things we asked people is, where do you think eco-hydrology is going and what is important? And almost everybody answers, we still need more interdisciplinary science, right? So just to have that in the back of your mind. So if that's the case, what are the tools? What are the tools for doing eco-hydrology? So a lot of our understanding about how plants use water and how plants respond to water availability comes from intensive measurements at field sites, right? Or in labs, doing field experimentation. We also increasingly in this era of big data, especially with a widespread availability of different remote sensing data sets, we can do empirical analysis, right? We can do machine learning. We can look at big empirical spatial pattern. But my argument and my career has really been looking at, well, in between these, we have something that I call process-based models of the linkages between ecosystem and hydrologic processes. And really what they do is knit together these two different ways of trying to understand what's happening in the environment. So really, I'll give you the punchline of my talk today, is that process-based models, even in this era of big data and machine learning, I think they're still valuable as a complement to these approaches. And I just want to give you some illustrations from my own work as to why I think that's the case. But I think that we're not really taking full advantage of the potential of these tools for a couple of reasons, but the one that I want to focus on is because we're really bad at visualizing what these models actually do. So you can leave now. This is my take-home message. I'm done. Okay, so obviously, you have to ask, well, what do I mean by a process-based model? So process-based models are models that to some extent encode not just empirical relationships, but some theory about how we think the world works, right? So a good classic example of this is the Penman-Monteith equation, which some of you may have run into in your career. And this is a way of estimating evapotranspiration from a leaf, but it encodes some of the things we know about what's going to control the amount of water a leaf uses, how much radiation you have on the leaf, whether or not the leaves are opening or closing their stomats, something about the humidity and the wind speed. So these are mechanistic understanding of what controls evapotranspiration. Right? Process-based models embed lots of these little mechanistic understandings in spatial models that also account for things like how that radiation forcing that hits the leaf might vary across a slope in a north versus south-facing slope. They also move water around on the landscape, so we can account for the fact that the trees down here maybe have more water than the trees up here. And if you look at the history of this type of modeling, we kind of started from hydrology, where plants were this static thing on the landscape that never changed. Maybe they opened and closed their stomats, but they were something like a leaf area index, but they were static. And as we evolved these models, we recognized that plants actually respond to conditions. Maybe if you're in a water-limited environment, they grow more. Maybe that has an effect. Maybe there's feedbacks here. And then more recently, we're also accounting for the fact that sometimes there's more dramatic changes to vegetation, the kind of forest mortality or fire that I showed you at the beginning of this talk. Right? So for example of why this is important, this is an old paper, right? Comes back from the early 90s, where here's an example of a runoff hydrograph, right? And up here we have the rainfall. And it's pretty clear that there's this reduction in runoff, right? Well, why is that happening? It's because forests are growing back. So it's a good example of why you can't just run a hydrologic model with a static vegetation, right? Because that regrowing vegetation, you're going to see it in that stream flow. This is nothing new. We've been doing this since the early 90s. Since that time, we've really evolved these types of process-based models, right? They represent many of the water cycle processes, differences between things like snow melt, differences between overstory and understory evaporation and transpiration, all kinds of things about drainage. We link these to carbon cycling models that allow the forest growth, the height, the amount of biomass, the deep depth of the roots to change over time in response. We include energy models so we can account for radiation controls on both water and carbon cycling, and nutrients as well, right? So if you're in a nutrient-limited environment, how that might affect forest growth. So there's lots of nice reviews about how sophisticated these process-based models have become. Myself, I've been a developer of one of those models, Rhesus, kind of like the monkey, that we've still been evolving. And in fact, most recently we included in our coupled model of carbon cycling and hydrology, a model of fire spread and fire severity, right? And we've published a bunch of papers showing that, and we do a pretty good job of, for example, representing, this is actually the water supply catchment for Santa Fe, New Mexico. And the colors here show frequently different parts of the watershed burn in different months. And we do a pretty good job of capturing the fire return interval that you would see from tree rings, for example, or burn scars in this watershed. So we even have some ways of validating that approach. So you could say, well, we have all these cool process-based models, right, that represent certainly the hydrologic controls on water availability for plants, and a lot about how plants are responding, even how plants are responding to disturbances. So, like, we're done. Can I just retire, go home? That's it, we're finished? So we're not, right? And the reason is really nicely articulated by Rodriguez Oturbe, quite a well-known eco-hydrologist, right? In one of his review paper, he wrote this statement, which basically makes 2 points. One is that what the dominant controlling mechanism is tends to change with scale. It looks a lot different if you're just looking at an individual tree or if you're looking at a particular watershed. So how you might represent these mechanisms changes with scale. And worse than that, they all vary with parameters that vary with the type of vegetation, the pedology of the soil, things about the subsurface, things about the climate that are really, really difficult to characterize. So we're still in this era where we have these really cool models, but it's still really hard to parameterize them. So we're still learning because we haven't solved the problems of scaling and parameterization. Right? So you might say to me, well, yeah, who cares? Because we're in this big era of big data, so why don't we just do empirical modeling and be done with all these process-based models? So here's an example of an empirical analysis that I quite like. This paper took some remote sensing data of vegetation greenness and correlated it with peak snow across the mountains of the Sierra Nevada in California. And what they found is there was a strong correlation, right? So years that have a lot of snow are years where you typically have more growth in the vegetation. And this is a nice empirical piece of work. However, it's limited, right? If we don't know what the mechanisms are that underlie this correlation, we don't necessarily know what's going to happen in the future. So for example, is it just the peak snow, or is peak snow so correlated with precipitation that you're really getting a precipitation signal? And that really matters here, because what's going to happen when things warm up? You're going to have less snow, but you might have the same amount of precipitation. So you have to understand more about what the underlying effect is, right? It doesn't tell you much about what controls variation in that. You get these nice correlations when you do this region-wide, but there's a lot of scatter in that relationship. And a forest manager wants to know what's affecting the growth of the forest in their particular watershed, or what's affecting stream flow locally, right? So it doesn't explain why there's so much heterogeneity in this response, right? So there's a reason to try to understand why you see these empirical patterns. What are the underlying mechanisms? Partly because that gives you more confidence in being able to predict what's going to happen in conditions we haven't seen before. And as you all know, we're in a situation where that's very likely to happen with global climate warming as well as rapid land use change. So we need an answer to these questions. I also think there's an intellectual richness to that. If you understand how some things work, how something actually works, how a system behaves, why it works, it gives you a way of understanding and thinking about that system that I really believe inspires creativity. And we'll get back to that. So what I'm saying here is that process-based models, right, they embed what we learn from on-the-ground field experiments and theories, right? And they help explain patterns in big data. So in a way, process-based models are, from the top down, they help give us an understanding of the mechanisms that we're seeing in empirical data, right? From bottom up, they help us take field experiments and say, well, what would be the implications of doing this field experiment in a different condition? So I want to give you two examples of both this top-down and bottom-up use of process-based models. So from the top down, I want to use these models to explain how changes in forest structure through mechanical thinning or fire or forest mortality, how does that affect the amount of water that the forest is using, right? Particularly in Mediterranean systems. So this is a question that people have asked for decades. And if you read the eco-hydrology literature, you'll find about once every 10 years, someone publishes a synthesis paper that says, okay, if we remove forest cover, how much does stream flow go up? So a couple things to notice about this is, yeah, stream flow does go up if you take trees out, right? But there's a lot of scatter in these relationships. It's different for different types of forests. And many of these were based on studies that looked at clear cutting. They're not really talking about smaller scale forest thinning. They're not talking about what happens when you have a moderate burn, right? Maybe the answer is different. They're also very short term, right? They don't look at what happens over time when the forest comes back. How quickly does that water yield recover? And in fact, if you narrow in and you look at some data on water yield changes after forest mortality events in semi-arid systems, you see not only declines in water yield, or not only increases in water yield, but sometimes you see declines. So what's going on there? Why are we seeing that? And in fact, we recently did a review of all the studies we could find in Mediterranean type environments, so environments that are water limited, where all the rain happens in the winter and you get very little rain in the summer. And we found very few studies that actually showed any increase in flow at all. What they did tend to show was an increase in growth of remaining trees. And you can imagine that there are mechanisms that might lead to this. So we take out the tree, right? But you removed the overstory here. Maybe you'll get more evaporation from the understory, right? Maybe you'll change the dynamics of snowmelt in such a way that you might increase evapotranspiration, right? Or maybe that remaining water is left for the remaining trees and they start to use it and grow more, right? So mechanistic models allow us to look at how different types of density reduction under different climates, different species compositions and geology, how they interact. What if these processes are big numbers and little numbers? What are the mechanisms that are really leading to the responses that we're talking about? So my work with RESIS, which is one of these fully coupled ecosystem models that models some of the things that would be important here. It models separately understory evaporation and snowmelt and overstory evaporation. It models the movement of water both laterally along the hill slope, but also between trees within patches, and is coupled to a carbon cycling model. So we can see how this affects the response of the remaining trees and the understory. So let's apply this model to a place that is a Mediterranean-type ecosystem. The western US really looks like that. All of the precipitation happens during the winter. There's very little precip in the summer. A lot of it is snow, right? So you get this big recharge of soil water in the spring. Okay, we applied it to a particular forest site, kind of a mid-elevation forest site where we had lots of data to calibrate the model. And so what you can do with a process-based model is say, well, which of these effects are important, right? What explains the variability that we're seeing in this empirical data? So what you can do with a model is do your thinning experiment in every year of a historic climate record. This shows precipitation deviation from the mean over the last, say, 50 years. So I can thin in every possible year to see what effect does year-to-year variation in climate have on the response that I would see. And then I can allow the forest to regrow. I can do it if the soils are shallow or deep. I can vary the amount of biomass I remove. And then something else I can vary that I think is important is I can vary the extent to which trees share water. Because we know very little about how entwined roots are in the subsurface. So since I don't know that, and I'm in a process-based situation, I can look at both situations. I can look at an end member. What if things are totally entwined? And if I take out this tree, it gets all of the water from the remaining tree? Or it's totally local, and trees just have roots kind of beneath their feet. So if I do that, what do I get? So let's look at this change in evapotranspiration. These graphs show change in evapotranspiration. So if you're above the line, you're increasing relative to the untreated, unthinned case. If you're below the line, you're decreasing. These are deep, mid, and shallow soils, right? All getting the same climate. The box plots show climate variation. So what year did you thin? Kind of what weather did you get after the thinning experiment? The two different colors show what happens if I vary the assumption about whether or not trees share water. And then you see the recovery as the forest grows back. And so one of the things to notice is that the soil depth makes a big difference in terms of how quickly your evapotranspiration comes back, right? So whether your soils are shallow or deep is going to be really important in terms of what the effect of thinning is going to be on water yield, right? The other thing to note is, especially for moderately deep soils, right, whether or not trees share water makes a big difference. And in fact, if they share water, you very quickly can get in situations where, in fact, your system is using more water than it was before. So we're coming up with mechanistic explanations for why some of our observations in these Mediterranean-type ecosystems sometimes show increases in water yield and sometimes show decreases in water yield. And we can also look at, well, it matters not just how much water yield we have, but what about those remaining trees? If we're thinning the forest, maybe we're going to reduce forest mortality, right? Maybe by thinning things out, the remaining trees will be healthier, they'll be more resilient to drought. How often is that likely to be the case? So these graphs show net primary productivity. You could think of that as a good indicator of how productive the tree is in a given year. And these are probability distributions across climate, so in any given year. The pink ones show the distributions prior to the thinning. This shows results for shallow. The ones on the bottom are deep. This is the first year right after thinning, and this is 5 years later. So, for example, in the deep soils, and this is a pretty heavy thinning experiment. I think it was at 30. Oh, the different colors show how much biomass you took away. So if you take out a lot of biomass, right, the remaining trees are much more productive. It's a really water-limited system. If they share water, you're going to get this bump in productivity, and foresters know that, right? But what's interesting is what happens 5 years later after you've allowed things to recover. In the deep soils, you've almost completely lost that effect. So yeah, maybe you can make trees more productive by thinning, less sensitive to drought, but it's only going to last you 5 years. In the shallow soils, you get something really interesting. You still see an effect, but it's only in the years where you typically had high productivity. Those are wet years. In these drier years, sometimes the thinned ones actually have lower productivity. So what's happening there? I call this too much of a good thing. You thin the forest, it was a good year, those trees put on more biomass, and then you get a drought. So you kind of over-invested in something. And in fact, there is field evidence that shows this, right? Large trees sometimes are more sensitive to drought. There is at least some field evidence that backs up this finding in the western US. So by taking this more mechanistic look to say, well, what's the importance of soils, for example, on how much water yield you get, or how much bump in productivity you get, we can say, well, how often would you need to thin to kind of maintain that treatment? It's going to be very different if your soils are shallow, right, versus deep, right? If you want to keep your change in evapotranspiration below this line, right? If you're in a shallow soil, you might have to thin every 3 years. Right? This also tells us that knowing whether or not tree roots share water is really important. It made a big difference. If you remember, those orange boxes were pretty separable from those blue boxes, right? Which tells us something about the kind of measurements that field scientists can make to really teach us something about what's going on in the system. And there are ways, for example, of using labeled carbon to kind of trace, in fact, how much do tree roots share resources. And so now we're working with field scientists to try to narrow down our uncertainty in that root sharing coefficient. Okay, so that's kind of a top-down use of process-based models. How about a bottom-up, right? Where we're using the models to extend field experiments. So here I'm going to look at a question that ecologists like to ask, which is, what's the benefit of biodiversity, right? If you have a mixed forest, is it better than all of those homogeneous stands of the same type of forest? And this is important, particularly as we have climate change where we're radically changing species, right? Particularly in places like the western US, Mediterranean systems, where you're getting fires. What grows back, right? So we really want to have a better understanding of how species change is likely to affect eco-hydrology in general. So what do species look like in a process-based model? What are they? Well, they're clearly going to be parameters, right? Some of the parameters, there's different types of parameters that will be important here. There's leaf scale ecophysiology parameters that vary between species. Different species, for example, have different maximal stomatal conductances, right? They have different light use efficiency parameters. There are also structural parameters, right? You have a carbon cycling model. You're estimating net photosynthesis. How do you allocate that? How do different trees have different strategies for allocating their carbon between leaves and stems and roots, right? Different trees also create, you may have noticed, different species have different shapes. Different shapes are going to affect how much water trees use, right? So all of those have to do with how different trees turn net photosynthesis into some sort of structure. And those are typically parameterized in these models. The thing is, we don't always know what these parameters are, right? Back to Rigoletto Turbe, we haven't run these models enough. We haven't made enough of these measurements to really know how to do this. But this is where we can work with field experiments, right? So I'm working with a colleague of mine, Tamir Klein, and his group in Israel, where they've done a really good job of monitoring everything they can in a mixed forest, right? As well as plots where they have individual stand of different species. And these are a bunch of species that we might see in a Mediterranean forest, right? Some cypress, some pines, some oaks, some nice little pistachios. And they measured all kinds of things in this forest, right? Things about the trees, right? Sap flow, litter fall, leaf turnover, leaf gas exchange, even getting down and actually measuring annual root growth. Here's an example of sap flow densities for the different trees going through the year for about 2 years of data. So they collected a lot of different data sets, right? So how can I couple this with my process-based model? Well, as a good modeler, what I'm going to do is run my model with a really wide range of these ecophysiological parameters, right? These allocation parameters, these leaf scale physiology parameters, right? And I'm going to use that to estimate things that we can measure, things about the tree structure, right? And things about the tree function, the amount of evapotranspiration for a couple of years, running it with the forcing data for that site. And then I can compare it both with measured data, sort of standard heights and standard biomass for these different species, and the additional data that was collected at this site. And then with some nice kind of parameter optimization and clustering algorithms, the kind of thing you who are engineers all know how to do, I can come up with a set of species-specific ecophysiological parameters, right? So I'm using this field data to kind of generate different species in my model. And here's an example of, here's a bunch of these parameters. You don't have to know what they are. This is looking at partial regression correlation coefficients to show, how it responds. Here, for example, is a parameter on what percentage of the leaves turn over each year and how that affects the ratio of leaf to stem carbon. So we can use this to derive these different parameters. And then we can use the model to help the field experiments. What they really want to know is, okay, we've learned something about how these different trees behave. What are the implications of that for whether mixed stands or homogeneous stands function differently, right? It's hard for them to do that with their data, but I can use their data to parameterize the model, and I can run experiments, right? I can run stands where I assume they're completely homogeneous and add those up, or I can assume that they're completely mixed, and the roots share water, and they essentially shade each other, right? So the taller trees will shade the neighboring trees that are of lower stature. And I can run this for, say, 20 years of data. This is just precipitation data in black. Red is the temperature data. You can see it rains when it's cold, right? Pretty much every year. It's a classic Mediterranean type system. And here's what I get. Here's my plant carbon, right, for all of my 6 different species, and then summed over the forest. The dotted ones show if I run it as an individual stand, homogeneous. The upper shaded ones show the plant carbon if I run it as a mixed stand, okay? And so you see for some of them, it doesn't change much, right? But for some of the species, you get quite a bump in plant carbon. I can do the same thing, for example, at looking at total transpiration, right? The ones with the black boundary are what it looked like prior to, what it looked like as a homogeneous stand. And the other ones show what happens when I mix them together, right? So for example, the pine, which tends to be a tall tree, ends up using more water. It's a tall tree with deep roots, right? So it's able to steal water from its shallow-rooted, shorter stature neighbors, right? The little shorter stature ones actually use less water, not really because their roots can't get water, but because now they're shaded, right, by their surrounding trees. These are things conceptually our ecologists know, but they really didn't have a way of figuring out, well, of quantifying how big an effect is this likely to be in a way that's believable. But because I use their measurements to differentiate different species, I've convinced them that my estimates of the model are pretty reasonable. And what's interesting is that you get an overall transpiration bump, by the mix stand, but you also get an increase, an overall increase in carbon. And in fact, greater water use efficiency, right? So you sequester more carbon, you use more water, but you have higher water use efficiency in the mix stand. So I've really quantified, given them a quantifiable estimate of how what they're learning about different species affects why biodiversity might be a good thing. Okay, so these are hopefully some nice and interesting examples of what we've been learning about both using process-based models to explain patterns in big data, big regional patterns that we're getting from remote sensing, and how we've used process-based models to extend what we learn from field experiments. And I can show you many papers that we've written that do this kind of thing, right? So this seems like a good thing to do. And I'm not the first person to say that this is how we should use process-based models, which is a little bit different from prediction. I'm really using them for understanding, not for trying to come up with a prediction for a water manager about how much water they're going to have in their reservoir next year, but to understand, for example, how climate change might affect forests and how that might affect their reservoir going forward. And there's been a bunch of papers in the literature that have talked about eco-hydrology modeling for hypothesis testing, talked about this idea of behavioral modeling, the need for the dialogue between experimentalists and modelers, placing conceptual models into a context. People keep saying we should do this. But if you actually look at the literature, we really don't do this very often. So you have to ask why. Like it seems, you know, I'm kind of telling, you're all going, yeah, this seems like a good idea. Why don't we do this, right? And even when we do, we don't believe the results, right? And I would argue that one of the main reasons is that these models, these process-based eco-hydrology models, have become black boxes, right? Nobody except maybe a few geeky modelers actually know what's going on inside of these models, right? So if they're supposed to help you understand things because of how they represent mechanisms, you better know how they represent mechanisms. And I would argue that we do a really poor job of doing that. So, you know, this has become really important, for example, in California, where there's this big question about, well, should we thin forests and where should we thin and how is that going to affect fire, right? And we recently did a review of all the hydrology studies that we could find where people used a hydrology or an eco-hydrology model to look at the effects of thinning. And you know, it was a real challenge to go through all those papers, and they all, what mechanisms they do include or don't include is totally variable between all the different models, right? Some of them, if you remember back to my example of why in Mediterranean-type ecosystems sometimes you don't get the increase in streamflow you would expect, it has a lot to do with what's happening in the understory. Some of these models don't even represent an understory, so they're not going to get that right. They differ in terms of whether they model recovery. They differ in terms of what they assume about the subsurface, which is fine. They're all hypotheses about how the world works, but it's really hard to figure that out. If you're lucky, you can find a paper that describes what the model does, but most of the often you actually have to go into the model code to figure this out, right? So my point is that these are really powerful tools that we're not making good use of because we aren't good at showing what they do. But we're in the era where there are a lot of computing and human-computer interaction and visualization tools that I think we could apply to solving this problem, right? Both in terms of visualizing model output, right? Making it much easier to play with model output by gaming, you know, for field scientists, taking the model output and actually having augmented reality so you can walk around and see what the model output is doing actually in your landscape, right? This would also help with public and students, right? Ways of doing guided model output, right? Data mining techniques, something like a random forest, applied to model output so you can start to unpack these models that give you hundreds and hundreds of variables, right? But also better tools for describing what's actually happening inside the model, right? Graphs of animations of the processes that are actually represented in the model. Now, we'd all like to do this, and I'll make the point that it's really hard to create that level of model documentation, which is why nobody does it. But we're in the era of computing where we could actually design tools that automatically generated that type of visual documentation, right? That would be really challenging, but I really think that that's what we should do. So I've slowly been trying to work on this, and this is very, beginning of moving in that direction with my own model, Rhesus. This gives you an example of, for our Sierra site, one of the things we wanted to communicate to people is the fact that what you see at the watershed scale is an amalgamation of a lot of heterogeneity in different parts of the watershed, right? So we worked with a VR gamer, and we created kind of Rhesus the game. We call it Future Mountain, where you can zoom in on different patches and you can see it snow. In the summer, you actually see some evapotranspiration happening here. It's still a little hokey, but it does allow you to start to actually visualize some of the processes represented in the model. And it was really fun and really enlightening to take this tool and present it to the public, for example, who have a real mistrust of models, and let them play with it. So we actually took this, we projected it on a big screen at a local art gallery. We made it a game where you could increase the temperature, you could change the speed at which the model moved through time, and down here on the bottom, we showed the precipitation, and you had it move through time. And what was instruction was how much conversation this generated by the public about what was going on, right? And it's starting to give them more of an intuitive feel. Okay, our fire is really hokey. We're working on that, okay? I'm not going to win any visualization awards for my fire, representation of fire. I apologize. But you get the idea of how we want to engage people in the deep and rich intelligence that I think is embedded inside these models. And then, what we really want, I was saying this notion of automatic, model documentation. What model documentation should look like and doesn't is you have some conceptual representation like this. You have the different types of processes. I click on that. It shows me this conceptual model. I say, I want to know how I do snowmelt. What are the snowmelt processes that I represent? I click on one of those. It gives me the paper and the equation. That's what we want. I don't do this because the time it would take me to do this, but this is what we should be doing, right? And I think there are tools that could help us do this in efficient ways, right? So I've been doing this kind of eco-hydrology modeling for a long time, and I've really come to the conclusion that this is what needs to happen next. Not necessarily better process representation or more data. We really need to solve the visualization problem on multiple fronts. And if I think we need to do that because a lot of eco-hydrology processes, not just forests, but certainly water availability and grasses, they're radically changing. So we need tools like this to help us respond and react and understand these changes. We're seeing more forest mortality events increasing, for example, throughout the world, right? So we need the best available science information to do that. And process-based models are really one way of integrating what we learn from intensive field experiments, what we see in empirical data analysis. But if we really want to make good use of these tools, I think we really have to reveal what's hidden inside those tools. So that's kind of my plea for the direction I think we should be going as an eco-hydrology community, and it's certainly the one that I'm trying to push towards on. This is who I am. The Tague Team Lab. All of this involves many people, both in my own lab and my collaborators, particularly in this talk from the Weizmann Institute in Israel, but I collaborate with people all over the world. And of course, I'm funded by great people like the NSF and other institutions. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Questions? Who wants to kick off? Philippe.
Great talk, thank you. I agree with you that visualization is very important, automation of documentation. But you kept referring to we should be doing this. So who is the we?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Who is the we? So I've been trying to do it, I've been trying to walk across to computer science and get, because we're going to need help to do this, right? This is a computing problem. And so I've been working with people, for instance, in my own institution in the human-computer interface design, the gaming people. These gaming people, they're good. They know what they're doing, right? So trying to engage those people through collaborative research projects, right? I think there are, but it needs to be funded, right? So we need to, I think, be looking to our funding organizations to fund working groups. Maybe we start to have working groups. Maybe we start to fund these kinds of collaborations, right? Ultimately, I think maybe we need like an institute that works on doing this, right? I think it has to be done kind of at that scale.
Ponu has a question here.
Thanks. Thanks for the nice talk and also fantastic work. Especially I'm impressed by this trying to model the biodiversity and its impact, looking at both the carbon sequestration and water, two major things. So I'm wondering how well these are calibrated, or the other side, being the eco people, are accepting these sort of results that you have?
Yeah, if I had to wave my hands, I would say that ecologists are more forgiving than hydrologists, right? In general, right? Hydrologists, if your stream flow natural cycle efficiency isn't above 0.8, then I don't even want to look at your model, right? Ecologists have a little bit more of a sense of, okay, sorry, I just fell. Ecologists have a little more of a sense of that. So they want to see, but I do validate against ecological data, right? So I can compare, for example, our estimates of carbon growth with interannual variation in tree rings, right? I can.
Sorry to interrupt, but you turned your microphone upside down, and I can't hear it very well.
Better?
Much better.
Ah, awesome. Okay, so there's things you can do. There's an interesting thing that happens in the carbon cycling world, and you can compare against flux tower data, which we do, right? Carbon cycling with measured flux tower. There's a lot of comparison between, say, model estimates of greenness and remote sensing. But that's a little tricky thing because, things like MODIS, which are big global data sets, they don't really measure greenness that well. There's a lot of issues. So, there's some validation issues that get really tricky because the data quality is maybe harder than streamflow, which we've really gotten good at measuring, right? So in ecology, I think it's a little more forgiving, but they do like to see the validation, and we certainly spend a lot of time doing that.
More questions?
Hi, thank you. I've run across this problem in my own work. I'm in applied math, and I work with biologists and with mathematicians. And I find that if I open a math paper on a mathematical model of a biological system, I'll get a good exposition of the model. And if I open a biology paper on a mathematical model, if I'm lucky, I'll get a 20-page appendix that is absolutely awful to read. And I was curious if in your work and in ecological journals, if it was, where it falls on that kind of spectrum of, do they actually encourage good expositions of models?
So I think part of the reason we got ourselves into this mess was, okay, if your model is fairly simple in terms of, say, the number of equations, which often in these mathematical equations papers they are. If you have 4 equations, you can write them down in the paper and great, right? But these models developed by embedding lots of different representations of processes. You could almost think of them as libraries of those little mathematical models, right? So once you have a library, and there's a value to having a library that evolves. Like as we learn a better model of leaf litter decomposition, right, from all these field experiments, you can put it in the context of something that is also modeling the full nitrogen cycle. So there's a real advantage to that, but it means it's libraries of equations, right? So it ends up generating these big appendices, right? If you're lucky, it's all in one appendix. Usually what happens is someone makes a little change to the model, so that's one paper and there's another change, and you have to kind of like play this game of going through all these papers. So that's why I think we need some sort of innovative way of representing these. You're not going to be able to put it all in one paper. It's not realistic if what you're talking about is a library of 20, 30, 40 different submodels.
We got one more here.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you use any wind field inside this model, and if so, then what is it like?
Greenfield, like...
No, wind field.
Oh, wind field. I thought greenfield. I'm like, green, what's a greenfield? Yeah, so certainly both in estimating evapotranspiration and certainly in the fire model, you can imagine wind really matters. We generate wind as an input to this model, right? So you can bring it in as either, if you have it, right, it can ingest spatial gridded patterns of wind, right? We really, in terms of the fire, it's really a fire regime model, so we're looking at sort of decadal probabilities of burn and burn severity. It's not a sophisticated enough fire model to actually model the movement of a particular fire that's generating its own wind. And you know, I would never let an on-the-ground fire manager dealing with a particular fire use this model, right? It's not that kind of model. It's more a model for saying where in your landscape are you likely to see more fires, more severe fires in the future, and what's likely to be the effect of thinning and fuel treatments on kind of fire statistics, right? But it's not a fire behavior model.
Nandita has a question.
Really interesting talk, Naomi. Enjoyed it a lot. I had a quick question about kind of following up on model validation kind of ideas. So you talked a lot about validation of ecological attributes. And in hydrology, one of the things is there's pretty much most of the time never validation of any of the ecological attributes. It's always water flow is the only parameter that we are validating the model against. So I wanted to hear a little bit about your thoughts about these, looking at multiple aspects of the ecosystem in terms of reducing equifinality? And are there trade-offs in your parameter space depending upon whether you're trying to model or trying to validate one vegetation growth or transpiration versus stream flow?
So I actually think you are going to do a better job if you are bringing together multiple disparate data sets to validate the model, right? Because then you're going to get at different processes, right? And in general, so for example, because otherwise, sometimes you can take a hydrology model, and so for example, it's pretty clear that, you know, changing vegetation is going to have some effect on hydrology, right? But let's say you're running a model that assumes that the vegetation is static. You're going to take some sort of tuning parameter that's going to account for that, which is probably going to work, but it's not going to work if suddenly you're going to do something that would change your vegetation in a way that it wasn't being changed before. Like you're going to have more fires, right? Or you're going to have more drought mortality, or, you know, so that's why I think it's so important to also be validating the ecological responses. But I think you have to move away from, okay, sometimes you have something like flux tower data, which is a little bit like stream flow. You're going to have a continuous time flow record, right? But for other things, it's, you have to be able to use kind of soft calibration, right? You have to be able to, because even flux towers, what's the footprint of the flux tower, right? It's not as, you know, it's easier to figure out what the footprint is of a stream gauge, right? There's issues there too, but it's not nearly as bad, right? You know, or tree ring growth, right? There's a lot of assumptions you have to make, sap flow data. So for example, one of the things we've done is with sap flow data, because it's very hard to scale sap flow data whole tree. We've looked at but what you can do is look at, well, when does the sap flow shut down? That tells you a lot about the functioning of the system. So we're validating that instead of an estimate of evaporation from the sap flow, which has a bunch of error associated with it. So there's a lot of art to using ecological data, and you really have to be thinking about soft calibration, fuzzy metrics for your calibration, rather than like an R squared between the time series.
Cool, thank you.
Anyone else? No one. Pono, you.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on evapotranspiration affecting local precipitation patterns?
Yeah, it does. I don't run a fully coupled climate model, so my model would not get at that. I think it depends on where you are. In the western US here, I don't think it has much of an effect. We get big atmospheric rivers that are coming in off the Pacific, right? And so local precipitation there isn't having much effect. But if you're at a place in the where you have a lot of convective summer storm events, I mean, there's clear evidence that that has an effect on evapotranspiration. So I think the answer to that question and how big a source of error that is and how you would think about bringing that in depends a little bit on where you are.
Thanks.
I was just wondering if you have your system more as an open source so other people can take and add things to it, or how is it there now?
Yeah, so we maintain our system on GitHub, and it is open source, right? And we have a community, and people gradually evolve the model, and multiple people work on it, and we try to manage the code that way. So we try to do the right thing. We don't have the resources to really do it well, right? I would need 2 or 3 full-time programmers to really do that properly, right? So one of the things I run up against is I'm a professor, not a modeling shop, right? So yeah, it's on GitHub. We have regular coding meetings, but sometimes people make changes and we just can't integrate it to the code because they didn't test it well, and we can't support that. So it is open source. It's pretty hard to use. It's a research model. It's not a model that a land manager is going to be able to run. You have to kind of know what you're doing. But we do provide documentation on the web. If you're someone who's familiar with modeling and kind of good with GIS, you could probably download it and run it.
One more question over there.
Hi. As you can see in the room, there's a lot of young faces here. Not mine. And they're probably shy to ask questions. So I'm wondering if you could, are there 2 or 3 particular kinds of puzzles that you're working on that you would, if you had an army of young minds to help you, what would those be?
Sure. Well, I've already given my, please can people work on this visualization problem? And you young people are the ones with the skills to do that, right? Can you go collaborate with the gaming people? There's so much you could do here, with augmented reality. There's so much. And thinking about what kind of games would help people understand what's going on, right? There's a huge area here that I think, a lot of people could work on. If you want to ask me that as a sort of eco-hydrologist, right, I would say we still have this question about roots, right? I can show with my model that whether roots share water and how roots respond, I think is still a big question, right? So strategic use of, isotopes for figuring out what water different trees are accessing, right? Or carbon isotopes for looking at how they share water. Different strategic ways of getting at not just what roots are in a given point in time, but how they respond to change. If I cut a tree over here or I change vegetation over here, is my tree going to adapt to that? I think adaptation is the other thing, right? I think there are a lot of unanswered questions about how both changes in species composition will happen with climate change and what the effects of that will be on water use, but also how individual species will evolve. In Israel, actually, there's this great experiment that it's hard to do because it takes 20 years, but they took Aleppo pine seeds from all around the Mediterranean basin, right? And they planted them all on this same hill slope, right? And then they let them grow up, right? Same species, same conditions, soil's the same slope, same radiation, same weather, everything's the same, right? And the tree stature 20 years later is completely different, which means the same species, because that seed came from a different place, individual species adapt to their conditions. I think this is going to be a big effect in a lot of ecological questions and even a lot of hydrologic questions, right? And so, go and talk to your plant genetic people. Go and talk to the ecophysiologists and figure out what we're learning about the way plants are adapting to changing conditions. I think how that affects things like hydrology, no one's really talking about that. It's a big question.
We got to stop here. Thank you so much, Professor Tague. Let's give her another round of applause. Thank you so much for coming.